Okay, all right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for sticking around to near the end of the conference. And today I'm very excited to tell you about when is assortment optimization optimal. So let me begin by telling you what the assortment optimization problem is. This is a commonly studied problem in revenue management. Imagine you're a retailer and you're trying to decide which SKUs or items, which of these sneakers you should place on your shelf. Each sneaker has like a fixed price, which is the brand price for that sneaker. And you choose some of these sneakers to carry on your shelf. And then a customer comes with the intention to buy some sneaker. They're going to have some preference ranking for these items at these prices. So in this case, the buyers, their first choice is the $150 pair. They're going to see their favorite on their shelf, and then they're going to buy that for $150. But now, here we could have made more money if we didn't carry the $150 pair. Because then the buyer would have only gotten their second choice, but they still would have been happy to buy this pair, and we would have earned more revenue. Now, of course, life isn't always this easy, because there's other buyers in our population who have different rankings. Maybe some people, they only want the $150 pair, and if you don't carry that, they're going to go to your competitor's store. They have an outside option. So generally, assortment optimization is about deciding what is the optimal subset of brands to carry in your store. And generally, there's a trade-off between smaller assortments, which reduce the cannibalization, which means it maximizes the chances that they buy the highest priced pair, versus larger assortments, which has a higher chance of everyone finding a pair of shoes they like. All right, so well-studied, very relevant retailing problem. But I guess at this conference, I probably don't have to convince you, is like if you put on your mechanism design hat, is why are we restricting ourselves to assortments? If you've seen the Plato's cave analogy, you can think assortments are just a very specific way of selling these shoes. But there could be all these different mechanisms or general selling methods out there for selling the same shoes. And actually, we're beginning to see some of these. So the sneakers I showed you here are actually from the website of endclothing.com, which is a designer fashion brand. And here, they sell these shoes in lotteries. So you have to join certain lotteries, and you have a chance of winning these shoes. And the fine print says, you give them your address or credit card. And it says, if you, quote, win any item, then you promise to pay the fixed price of that item. And I should say, this is a type of lottery that's different than traditional lotteries used to sell, say, hotel rooms. Those lotteries usually entice you by saying, if you agree to a random hotel room, you sort of get a cheaper price. Here, there's no discounts. Every shoe still has a fixed price, and this is important for protecting the brand value. You don't want to be selling the shoe at a lower price. So motivated by observations like this, the research question we ask is, what is the best method for selling items in this assortment optimization environment, given the incentives and information between the buyer and the seller? So let me just recap the salient features. So I have items, and I'm assuming the prices are fixed. Alternatively, you can think of each item as having some fixed benefit to the seller if that gets chosen by the buyer. The buyer wants at most one of these options. The buyer's ranking is private, but I know the distribution of my customers' preferences. And importantly, the buyer's incentives are generally unaligned with the seller's. So the seller just wants the buyer to choose the highest priced option. But the buyer wants their first choice, which is generally not the highest priced option. And importantly, the buyer always has an outside option. So the seller can't just say, hey, look, I'm only going to give you one option. You have to pick this $250 pair. So that's where the tension in this problem is coming from. All right, so this is the outline of the talk. I'm going to give a mechanism design formulation of this environment. I'm going to show you that this is a non-trivial question and that assortments indeed can be suboptimal. I'll talk about relation to the literature. Then I'll try to quickly state the main results. And then time permitting, I'll talk about some extensions. All right, so Here's just some notation quickly. I'm going to let the universe of items be denoted by N. RJ is going to be the fixed price of each item J. For a buyer, I'm going to capture their preferences by what I call a list. This is an ordered subset of the universe of items, and these are the items that you're willing to purchase, that you rank above the outside option. I'm going to assume L is drawn from a known distribution D, and an assortment is just a specific way of selling these items, which is saying, I'm going to show you a take it or leave it subset. You choose one or more items from it, or one or fewer items from it. OK, so now let me show you the simplest example I can think of that shows assortments are generally suboptimal. And I would say this is maybe the key slide in the talk to convince you, hopefully, that this is an interesting problem. So in this example, there's 4 items. Item A is the item that the seller wants to sell. Has a price of 2. Everything else has a price of 1. The buyer's list is drawn uniformly from all possible subsets of size 2. Importantly, it's always given in reverse alphabetical order, which means when the item A, the buyer is willing to purchase, it's always their second choice, not their first choice. So OK, let's see. This is the instance of the problem. Let's see how well we can do with assortments. You always want to offer the highest priced item. And if you do that, then the first 3 customer types will pay you $2. But you're not going to capture the second half of the market. Your expected revenue is going to be 6/6. And so I can offer one of the cheaper items, B, to increase my market share. But as you can see, I've now caused some cannibalization. This customer who had list BA, who previously paid me $2, is now only paying me $1. Nonetheless, I've managed to increase my expected revenue to 7/6. So you can play around with different assortments. If I offer 2 cheap items, then I capture the full market, but there's even more cannibalization. And at the end of the day, I can't overcome 7/6 expected revenue. OK, let me now tell you a lottery mechanism that hopefully you think is reasonable for selling these items. It's called a top 2 lottery, which is as follows. The buyer submits up to 2 distinct items that they're willing to purchase. And each item the buyer submits, they get with probability 1/2. Importantly, if you only submit 1 item, then you get what you submit with probability 1/2, and you get nothing with probability 1/2. So I claim that under this lottery, it's reasonable to presume that each buyer will submit both items on their list. Because even if my type is BA, I can't only submit B and have a higher chance of getting B. Because by definition, I would also want to submit A because I'd rather get A than nothing. And so that means I'm going to earn an average of 1.5 from each of the first 3 types, and still earn an average of 1 from the latter 3 types, for an expected revenue of 7.5/6. Essentially, I've managed to increase the sales of my high-price item A without losing total market share. And so this shows, at least for a general instance, assortments can be suboptimal. All right, so let me now try to formalize quickly what is the definition of all allowable selling mechanisms in this environment. So you can take your, this is a fairly standard mechanism design formulation. Basically, it's the buyer reports their type, which is their list L, and then the mechanism is defined for each L and J by xj of L, which is the probability that you buy item J when you report L. So all of the other the constraints are standard. So I should just talk a bit about the incentive compatibility constraint. So this is now requires some definition. Because basically what it says is, if I report truthfully, let's say my true list is L, if I report truthfully, I get some lottery that is defined by a vector of these probabilities over J. And then if I tell some lie L prime, I get a different lottery. And this has to say I prefer my lottery from telling the truth over the lottery I would get from telling a lie. But for ordinal rankings, this is not easily defined. It's like, do I want to always get my second choice, or do I want to get my first choice half the time and third choice half the time? I don't have time to fully justify my definition. I'm just going to say I choose a particular definition in this scenario, which is fairly standard, originating from a paper by Gibbard in 1977. I'm basically placing a strong incentive constraint on the mechanism that says the mechanism has to be designed such that truth-telling maximizes your probability of receiving one of your k most preferred items simultaneously for all k. So regardless if you're just trying to get your favorite or you're trying to maximize the chances of getting one of your 2 favorites or 3 favorites, doesn't matter. You want to tell the truth. Other formulations are possible. I have some arguments in the paper for where I believe this is the most interesting formulation. And also, this still leaves a very rich space of mechanisms. In fact, there's a one-to-one correspondence with monotone submodular functions. OK, so let me now state the problem. So just some notation for any list L and for any index k less than the length of the list. I'm going to let L1 sub k denote the set of my k most preferred items. So basically, you can formulate the mechanism design problem as an LP. My strong truthfulness constraints are just the first set of constraints. This defines a polyhedron. And the mechanism design revenue is simply the maximum revenue I can earn over this incentive-compatible polytope. We show that under this definition, actually, there's a one-to-one correspondence between deterministic mechanisms and assortments and integer points in this polytope. So assortment optimization is the same optimization problem restricted to integer points. So the question we're asking is, when does opt s over the integer points equal the general opt x over the polytope? And so I should just remark, the polytope P doesn't depend on the distribution or the prices at all, so it doesn't depend on the instance. Okay, so we know the instance defined by the distribution and the prices only affect the objective function. So basically, we know this polytope isn't integral, because if you believe my last example, I showed you an instance where the unique optimal solution was a non-integer point. So this polyhedron must have non-integer extreme points. But the question is basically, what conditions can we place on the distribution D that guarantees the existence of an integer optimal solution? And so actually, which is standard in assortment optimization, we're only going to impose some conditions on the distribution D, and then show that even if an adversary gets to choose the RJs, they can't sort of rotate the objective in the direction that exposes one of these non-integer extreme points. OK, so I'm going to now just position this problem in the literature. Unfortunately, I have to skip the coffee break, but I'm Canadian, so I like this one. But OK, so here are some characteristics. And I do think this model is new, but also well motivated in relation to some large existing streams of work. So revenue maximizing mechanism design, very large area. This is very few references. But our main difference from them is that we are doing prior dependent optimization. We are doing mechanism design. But importantly here, we're assuming the prices are fixed. So we don't get to choose prices. Whereas in this line of work, price is always a decision variable. Assortment optimization, we already went over. We're doing prior dependent optimization, and pricing is not a decision, but we're the first to consider the more general mechanism design formulation of assortments. And finally, I should also say there's this large area of sometimes called mechanism design without money, which has studied allocations, designing allocations where people report ordinal preferences. Our main difference there is twofold. One is generally the mechanisms in this area are prior free. And second of all, also, generally the tension in this area comes from there being like multiple agents who either like disagree on who should be president, or like they both want to go to the same school and there's only one seat. Our problem is interesting even with a single agent, because there's a mismatch of incentives between the designer and the agent. So our work lies in the middle here. And then from a practical point of view, it's also similar to the idea of selling opaque products or loot boxes. OK, so in the few minutes I have, let me try to state our main results. So we show that for a commonly studied class of choice models in the assortment optimization literature, which are called Markov chain choice models, assortments are in fact optimal. So let me tell you what this is. The definition is quite easy. Basically, it's a list distribution generated as follows. I have a Markov chain where each item appears once. I have a node for each item, and I have a probability of starting on each item. And basically, the list is generated in a memory list fashion as follows. You start at one of the nodes according to the prescribed probabilities, and you kind of like bounce around. Every time you visit a node for the first time, you add that to the back of your list, and the list terminates when you hit a terminal state 0. So we show that for this class of list distributions, regardless of the prices, assortments are always optimal. The proof is actually quite easy. Essentially, we relax it to an optimal stopping problem, and optimal stopping on Markov chains is very well understood. More generally, we derive a sufficient condition that shows that actually under a lot of the well-studied choice models in the literature, like MNL, multinomial logic, nested logic with a small number of items, they also satisfy our sufficient condition, so assortments are also optimal. Now, what about suboptimality gaps? Oh, I still have 5 minutes? I see it as I only have 1 minute, but okay, I'll try to finish in 2 or 3 minutes, but I'll talk a bit slower, thank you. So suboptimality gaps when this is not satisfied. So I'll just state some results. Okay, so we derived a sufficient condition under which assortments were optimal. But for general list distributions, so we show the following, which is we can define sort of subclasses of mechanisms. I said earlier there's a one-to-one correspondence between IC mechanisms under this definition and monotone submodular functions. So if we take what I call budget additive mechanisms, those corresponding to budget additive submodular functions, then we can show that assortments can give a constant factor approximation. We also show that if, for general distribution, but if all your lists are bounded to have length at most L, then we can get another constant factor approximation. And then we also show that generally, if you allow for arbitrary distributions over arbitrary lists and arbitrary mechanisms, then assortments can be worse by an unbounded factor. So you can't get a constant factor approximation. OK, and then I'll end with the following, which is even if you don't care about mechanisms in this assortment space at all, like you think, OK, it's not feasible to use these lotteries to sell these shoes, we actually show one final result, which is just the concept of a mechanism can actually provide a tighter linear programming relaxation for assortment optimization under the model where you're given an explicit distribution over preference lists. So this shows that even if you only care about solving assortment optimization, you don't believe me at all that mechanisms could be used, you can still use the concept of a mechanism to speed up the solution and the computation of optimal assortments. OK, so let me now wrap up. In this work, we make the following main contributions. On the modeling side, we provide a mechanism design formulation of assortment optimization that characterizes the best way of selling items in this fixed price unit demand environment. We show assortments are suboptimal in general. On the technical side, we show several results, including that assortments are actually optimal for Markov chain choice models, which includes multinomial logic, the most commonly studied choice model. And finally, I'm actually quite excited about the major implication in that I gave you a very idiosyncratic example at the beginning where I had to assume everyone had exactly 2 items on their list given in reverse alphabetical order. I had to do a lot of work, basically, to show that assortments are suboptimal. And so generally, I would say, for Markov chain choice models, actually, all the work that the revenue management community has done in optimizing assortments, this work shows we're not just optimizing assortments. We're actually computing the economic limit of how much money we can make when selling these fixed price substitute items. And so if we come back to this picture, it's like assortments are shadows on the wall. Generally, you could have much more elaborate selling mechanisms. But actually, if you go outside of Plato's cave, there's an even bigger world out there. And these shadow dogs and horses that corresponded to assortments, They actually mostly dominate this outside world. Assortments are usually optimal. Thank you very much.
Any questions from our audience?
Thanks for a very interesting talk. I was just wondering if you could expand on, you briefly touched on the definition of truthfulness in there. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about it and what that particular assumption over the ordinal rankings means.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so the question was, can I elaborate on the specific definition of ordinal truthfulness? Yeah. So basically, I'm basically imposing a fairly strong one, which says you essentially have stochastic dominance in telling the truth. So there's an equivalent interpretation of this condition, which is when you report a particular list, given any real cardinal utilities you could have that are consistent with that list, regardless of what they are, truth-telling has to maximize your expected utility. So I would say another natural formulation is just you ask the buyers to report cardinal utilities, and then you just promise maximizing their expected utility, which would be perhaps more standard. One reason it doesn't lead to a very interesting question is because assortments are essentially never optimal, because there you can sell an item that is never on the buyer's list but has a price of 1 billion. You could have a formulation with the cardinal incentive compatibility plus you impose individual rationality so that can't happen. So you could study some question like that, and maybe assortments are my results could fail to hold under an assortment under a model like that. So it's a great question. Yeah.
So the polytope that you define, so it gave some examples where it doesn't have integral extreme points. You can also ask the question, when does that polytope have all its extreme points integrated?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So I cheated a bit on this slide. I sort of imagined we always have the same polytope. Even if some list doesn't exist in the support, I'm going to have it in the polytope just to make the point that generally the polytope is not sensitive. Yeah, but no, that's a great point. So I haven't considered under which, if I only restrict the support but I don't restrict the objective, can I create an integral polytope? Yeah, but I guess the example shows you that even if you allow for all those six, so yeah, I don't know the answer, but that's a great point, yeah. Gagan, hey, how's it going? Hey.
So what is the problem from the online retail setting, right? But in online setting, you can also personalize your assortments, right? Traditionally, there's certain offline setting where you cannot personalize, right? Have you tried to sort of model personalization into the assortment optimization?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I guess here I'm thinking of it as when I say there's a distribution over your customers, you can also think of this as a distribution over your customers with a particular set of characteristics or something. So yeah. So you can think of this as I'm asking the question for given a particular set of customers with a given IP or something, I have a distribution a priori, and it's I'm asking when are assortments optimal. Yeah. So I would say the question of personalization is a different one. This is basically I'm saying if I can't differentiate between a pool of customers other than through preferences that you strategically disclose, when can I do better with mechanisms? Yeah.
Do you have an example under which your polytope is actually strictly strongly delivered seamlesses?
Yes, I don't have it on the slides, but I can explain it offline. Yeah. Basically, it's not hard to see that one set of constraints implies the other, but vice versa is not true.
Yeah. Certainly the is easy, but I was wondering if you had an example where the one is tied and the other is not. So.
Yeah, I can give it to you offline. Yeah, thanks. Bar.
It's a constraints look very stochastic dominance, right?
Yeah. No, that's exactly what it is. That's essentially what it is. Yeah.
There was this literature and mathematical finance, and the objective is also very similar to a portfolio, but you optimize for something else. Usually, in this literature, you look for the weights, but in your case, it's kind of fixed, it's prices. I was wondering if you thought about a connection, but there is all this literature. Like it's the same thing objective, same constraint, but like you optimize for something else. So I don't know.
Yeah, no. So no, that's a great point. So yeah, no, I don't really know that. Yeah.
Like duality, I don't know if it's connected.
Yeah, no, because I said the connection with monotone submodular functions, but I haven't seen sort of, so basically there is like a correspondence between sets of feasible solutions to this polyhedron submodular functions. I haven't seen that connection before, but yeah, if you know of a place where it might exist, it might be, yeah. But yeah, I did notice that, so it does seem like it's very related to a lot of other things.
Yeah, because a weird comment on that, you probably with Boulder is what that constraint actually gives you. It's going to be like some weird thing like additive prices that you get for adding individual like things to the server, which is like similar to like the submodular difference type results. But I don't know about that yet. So.
Yeah, okay. No, thanks a lot for the suggestion. No, I haven't tried that. Yeah. So I haven't explored this fully at all. This last point, I think this is a sort of like a result I added at the end, but I think like, I think definitely there's, I think there's a lot of future directions to explore related to these things, yeah.
All right. So with that, that concludes our session. Let's all thank for our speakers and also our coordinator Lola here for making this happen.